Level 1. Unaware civilian. At this level, you live entirely inside the legal and visible economy. Your income comes from regulated sources like a salary, hourly wage, or a registered business, and every transaction you make flows through official systems, banks, credit cards, and digital payments. Everything around you feels structured, transparent, and predictable. You shop at licensed stores, use approved services, and pay taxes without questioning how the system works beneath the surface. From your perspective, prices are fair, supply chains are legitimate, and rules are consistently enforced. You trust institutions, government agencies, financial systems, and employers, and assume that most people operate within the same boundaries. The idea of an underground or hidden economy rarely crosses your mind, and when it does, it feels distant or irrelevant to your daily life. Your social circle reflects the same pattern, reinforcing a shared belief in stability and compliance. At this stage, laws feel fixed, not flexible. There's no need to look for shortcuts or alternatives because the system appears to work as intended. Your focus is on routine life, earning income, managing expenses, and maintaining financial security, without realizing that an entirely separate layer of economic activity exists alongside the one you see. Level 2. Aware observer. You start to notice that not all economic activity follows the same rules. It usually begins with something small, a news story, a documentary, a conversation. You hear about counterfeit goods, unreported income, or transactions that happen outside official systems. At first it feels distant, more like information than something real. But the idea stays with you. You realize that not everything is tracked, taxed, or regulated the way you assumed. There are parts of the economy that operate quietly without visibility. You might hear about someone paying in cash to avoid fees, or buying something that doesn't come through the official channels. None of it directly involves you. You are still fully inside the legal system, but your understanding has changed. You no longer assume the system is complete. You start to see that there are gaps, and that some people know how to use them. Level 3. Occasional exposure. You begin to encounter situations where the rules are not followed exactly, not in extreme ways, but in small, practical ones. A contractor offers a lower price for cash. A service is done without paperwork. A product is sold outside official channels. Nothing about it feels dramatic. It feels normal. You start to understand how these situations work. The transaction still happens, but without the structure you're used to. No formal record, no oversight, just an agreement between people. You see the trade-off clearly. Lower cost, more flexibility, but less protection. If something goes wrong, there is no system to rely on. At this level, you are not deeply involved, but you are no longer disconnected. You recognize that these types of transactions exist around you, not as exceptions, as part of how the economy actually functions in certain spaces. And once you see it, it becomes easier to notice again. Level 4. Indirect participant. At some point, you stop just observing and begin participating in small ways. Nothing extreme, but enough to change your relationship with the system. You might accept cash for a side job, pay someone directly to avoid extra costs, or take part in transactions that are not fully reported. It doesn't feel like stepping outside the system. It feels like using it differently. You understand why people do it. It's faster, more flexible, and sometimes more efficient. There are fewer steps, fewer fees, and fewer restrictions. But you also understand the trade-offs. There are no guarantees, no formal protection if something goes wrong. You rely more on personal judgment than formal rules. At this level, your mindset shifts. You no longer see the system as fixed. You see where it can be adjusted. And once you begin operating in that space, even in small ways, your awareness increases. Because now you are not just seeing the gaps, you're using them. Level 5. Networked environment. Your access starts to depend on people, not systems. Opportunities no longer come from platforms or listings. They come through conversations, introductions, and relationships. You notice that certain transactions are not visible to everyone. They move through networks where trust matters more than formal verification. If someone is reliable, they are included. If not, they are excluded. There are no contracts in the traditional sense, no guarantees beyond reputation. Information is not public, it is shared selectively. At this level, knowing the right people becomes more valuable than knowing the rules. Access is limited, not by regulation, but by trust. You begin to understand that this part of the economy runs differently. It is not open, it is not transparent, it is built on relationships. And once you are connected to that network, your perspective changes again because you start to see patterns behind the transactions, not just what is happening, but how it works. Level 6. Insider awareness. You begin to see the system as a whole, not just individual situations. Transactions that once looked separate now appear connected. Money moves through layers, often passing through intermediaries before reaching its final destination. You notice patterns, how transactions are structured, how risk is reduced, how visibility is avoided. It becomes less about specific actions and more about how the system is designed. You understand that these activities are not random. They follow logic shaped by incentives, regulation, and opportunity. Where restrictions increase, alternative paths appear. You also become more aware of risk, legal consequences, financial loss, lack of protection. At this level, caution becomes part of your thinking. You are not reacting anymore. You are analyzing. You recognize how information, trust, and timing influence outcomes. Because once you understand the structure, you no longer see isolated transactions. You see a system operating alongside the visible economy. Level 7. High-level operators. You begin to understand that some parts of this system operate at a much larger scale, not small transactions or isolated exchanges, but coordinated activity involving significant amounts of money and multiple layers of participants. These operations are structured. They use intermediaries, separate entities, and controlled flows of information. Each part has a role. Each step is designed to reduce exposure and manage risk. From the outside, very little is visible. What you do see appears ordinary. What actually happens is more complex. At this level, scale changes everything. Larger transactions require planning, coordination, and systems that can handle movement without drawing attention. It is no longer informal, it is organized. You are still observing, not participating, but your understanding deepens. You recognize that this is not just a collection of small actions. It is a structured environment operating with its own rules. And once it reaches the scale, it begins to connect to larger systems, not just markets, but power. Level 8. System-level influence. At this level, you begin to see how hidden economic activity connects to larger systems. It is no longer just about transactions or networks. It intersects with regulation, global markets, and institutions that shape how money moves at scale. What operates quietly in one area can influence outcomes in another, often without direct visibility. You understand that these systems do not exist separately from the formal economy. They exist alongside it, sometimes filling gaps, sometimes exploiting them. Capital flows through both worlds, depending on incentives, restrictions, and access. The impact is not always obvious. It does not appear in everyday transactions or public reports, but it can influence pricing, availability, and movement of resources across industries. At this level, your perspective is fully structural. You no longer see isolated activity. You see how different layers connect and interact, because the system is not defined by what is visible. It is defined by how everything, visible and invisible, works together.